Well, good morning and welcome to our class today. I appreciate your interest in what we're doing. We are finishing the study of the book of Acts. Paul has endured a number of instances where he had to stand before authorities, both Jewish and Roman, to defend himself. And now he's on his way to Rome because he's appealed all the way to the emperor, which is his right as a Roman citizen. The reason for that is the fact that the procurator of Judea, Porcius Festus, had failed to acquit him, which he should have done. And for favor for the Jews, he continued to hold him and want him to go to Jerusalem and so forth. So he's on his way to Rome, and it's quite a voyage. We're going to go not too hurriedly, I hope, but I want to cover the whole thing. I don't want to split the voyage into two parts. So for that reason, we're going to look rather verse by verse instead of reading large sections of it and going back and analyzing. But as we go, we'd like for you to notice some things. One, notice how the church has spread, how the gospel has spread, because we find believers all over as Paul stops at these various places. We don't know who has established these churches. We don't know the circumstances. All we can say is the gospel has spread rapidly. And Paul is only one of the many, many people who share the gospel. Secondly, I want you to notice how very detailed Luke is. He knows nautical terms. He is very familiar with them. And some have said this is, Linsky said at least, this is the best record of an extended ancient voyage. And the third thing I want you to notice is how well Paul is received and how well he's treated the whole company. It's quite a contrast from the way he's been treated by those Jews who were absolutely determined to kill him. So with that in mind, let's join this journey to Rome, see if we can get Paul to Rome, and we'll just go along with him this morning. Now, we're covering Acts 27, verses 1 to the end of the chapter, into 28 to verse 16. Now, first of all, here's the map. Here's the map of the entire journey. You'll notice where on the right side of the map, Judea, you can see Caesarea. He starts from Caesarea, the Roman capital of Judea, sails to Sidon, and then on around to Lycia and Myra, to Rhodes, around Crete, a long journey to Malta, up to Sicily, to the tip of Italy at Rhegium, and then up to Puteoli, the port of Naples, and taking the Appian Way into Rome. And the text, Acts 27, verse 1. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Julius may have known Paul. We don't know. I rather suspect he did. The Augustan cohort, of course, was established by the Emperor Augustus, a number of cohorts, but this seems to be one that belonged particularly to him. And Julius acts very responsibly. Embarking on a ship of Adramyttium, that is located just near in Mysia on the coast across from Lesbos, and often ships would put in there. So this is a ship from Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. That means it's a coaster. It's just hugging the coast as it goes along. Therefore, it's a small vessel. We put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. Now, notice the we passage. When we see we know Luke is along. That means that we have Paul, we have Luke, and we have Aristarchus. Aristarchus was from Thessalonica. He and Luke were both among the group that brought the contribution to Jerusalem. Verse 3, the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. Sidon, of course, the Phoenician city, it is now in Lebanon, a short distance to the north of Caesarea. And Julius allowed him to see his friends. No doubt his friends were Christians, and they looked after him. Notice how Julius is going to trust Paul. He doesn't fear that Paul is going to make a run for it and try to escape. And so he allows him to have a good deal of freedom. So he visits with these Christians at Sidon. We don't know who established the church there, but it is there. And verse 4 says, putting out to sea from Sidon, from there we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. Interesting, Luke makes that comment, and this is the first time that we see it. They had left probably sometime in August. This was toward the end of the period that one could sail safely because of weather. The period from September into November was a very troublesome time, a very dangerous time. Let's say it was iffy as far as the traveling conditions were concerned. It was likely that there would be problems, possible, but not suggested to travel then. And yet they're going to go at that point. I think they left in August thinking that the weather would be good enough that they could get through that problematic period and get to Rome before the really bad weather set in. That failed. You can see what is going to happen here. Winds were against us. So verse 5 says, when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, that means they have sailed now from the coast of Palestine, Phoenicia. They've sailed to what is now Turkey, Cilicia and Pamphylia. Of course, Paul came from Cilicia, and came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. This is a transfer to a larger vessel. Now they have to transfer all of their cargo because these ships are cargo ships. They are leased by the government, and they carry not only freight, but they carry passengers. These larger vessels, such as this one, a ship of Alexandria, would carry 600 souls. It would be from about 600 up to 1,000 tons. So it was capable of going out into the open sea. Verse 6, there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy, put us on board. Verse 7, excuse me, we sailed slowly for a number of days. The reason they sailed slowly is the fact that the wind is contrary, slowing them down. That is going to be costly. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. That is the port of Rhodes. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. The wind is coming from the north. It's slowing them down. Verse 8, coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. And notice how Luke is emphasizing that we can't go farther. We have to sail with difficulty. He says that twice, verse 7 and verse 8, with difficulty. So it doesn't forebode good things for their travels. And when they reached November 11th, when anyone reached November 11th, all sailing ceased in the Mediterranean area. Ships put in for the winter and did not resume normally until about March the 10th. Here's the port of Sidon. This is as it appears today, of course, in the country of Lebanon. And it is from this point that Paul will leave. And going back to the map, I'm going to give you some close-up views of the map as we go along. You will see where Caesarea is, Caesarea Maritima. That's the Roman capital of Judea. North to Sidon, that is a distance, if you look to the left, it's a distance of 67 miles. And then going out, as he said, to the open sea and sailing under the lee of Cyprus, that is to avoid the wind, from Sidon to Myra is 500 miles. And then from Myra on to Rhodes. Myra is where they change ships to a larger ship. Then they're going to sail to Rhodes, which is 130 miles. You see where it is on the far left of your map. And here from where they're going to leave from Myra, going to Rhodes at Cnidus, and then down to Salmone, and around the lee side of Crete to Fair Havens. And then they're going to, as we'll see in a moment, they're going to attempt to go to Phoenix, unable to do that. The distance from Cnidus to Salmone, 130 miles, and from Salmone to Fair Havens, 80 miles. So let's go back to the text now. Well, first, here's the harbor at Rhodes, a picture of that, which today it would be standing on at Rhodes, looking toward the island of Cnidus, and this is where the harbor is. This is called St. Paul's Harbor. And this is a picture of Fair Havens, which Luke describes as a place, indicating that it wasn't the main harbor, and he was maybe a little surprised that it even existed. It's a place called Fair Havens. If you notice it, it looks like a very protected harbor, and it was. And it would have been better had they stayed there. Since much time had passed, Luke no doubt is getting concerned. Much time had passed. Unexpectedly, they are delayed. Much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over. And now Paul, what Luke is pointing out here is that Paul and the others observed the fast, which would have been the Day of Atonement. That's in October. And obviously, Luke's language suggests that they had assumed that they would be much farther along in their journey by this point. They have been delayed to this point in mid-October. And he says, it is dangerous now. And so Paul advised them, and notice verse 10, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and with much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Now, the statement is, "Sirs, I perceive, I believe, I have reached the conclusion." This is not a statement that was inspired by God for Paul to say. Certainly, it was inspired by God for Luke to write, because it's accurately what Paul said, but it is a perception on Paul's part that there will be, because of the fact it is so very late, a loss of the cargo and the ship and the lives. Paul was right about two of these losses, but not the third, because God is going to reveal something to him, as we'll see later on. Verse 11, "But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said." That suggests that there was some type of a meeting, a council. What are we going to do? Are we going to stay here? Are we going to go on? And that would indicate that there are at least four people in this council: the centurion, the pilot, the owner of the ship, and Paul. The government no doubt leases the ship. This would suggest that this person actually owns it, and it has been leased by the government. And with these four people discussing it, Paul has a strong advice that they not proceed. And so verse 12 says, "Because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there." So the result is of this council of four people, Luke says the majority, in other words, three, it was 3 against 1, the centurion, the pilot, and the owner, decided to put out to sea from there. The centurion going along with them, assuming, no doubt, that they knew more about navigation than Paul did. So they're following the chance that somehow they could go from Fair Havens to Phoenix, a harbor of Crete. This, of course, was a good harbor, an excellent harbor, and they're thinking much better than Fair Havens. As far as the statement that it would face both southwest and northwest, that seems a little problematic. that it can face two directions at the same time, south and north, it is possible that the entire harbor contained two harbors within it with these directions, but we can't be sure. And anyway, they don't get there. And so here again is the map, and you can see where they were at Fair Havens. You can see Phoenix, and notice the island of Clauda. There's a very small island, very close to Crete. From Fair Havens to Phoenix is 40 miles, and from Phoenix to Clauda was 50 miles. So they have set out. They're not going to reach Phoenix because of the weather. Now, the south wind blew gently. Supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. The north wind, that strong wind that had held them back and delayed them so much, stopped, and a gentle south wind was blowing. And they're saying, we've made it, the weather has changed, so we can go. So they hoisted their sails and off they went, weighed anchor, sailed along Crete, again close to the shore on the lee side. But as soon as they have come beyond, almost beyond Crete, verse 14 says, a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. Tempestuous wind, tufos is the Greek word. We get our word typhoon from it. It was, in fact, and we should know this from current weather situations, it was a hurricane. And they called it a northeaster because it came northeast. And it came down from the land, which would indicate that the wind came whistling down from the mountains of Crete, which were about 7,000 feet up, and struck the ship. And the ship, verse 15 says, when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we give way to it and were driven along. 16, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda. So they made it from Crete now to Cauda, this small island. It's called Gozzo by the Italians and Gaudo by the Greeks today, still there. We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat, meaning the small boat, and they're going to hoist it up, verse 17, and use these supports to undergird the ship, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, and lowered the gear and were driven along. You can see here that this small boat is raised because they are going to have to get under the ship to gird it with what is called frapping. They were cables, and they run transversely under the ship. These ships have planking that runs horizontally. So of course the fracking is going to run transversely to bind it together. The danger is that in a storm, the planking could come loose, even come off. When that does, then of course, water is going to come into the ship. It's going to be founder perhaps. That's dangerous. So these cables, this frapping, would hold the ship together in such a situation. So we managed, before I leave verse 16, notice, we managed with difficulties to secure the ship's boat. That suggests that Luke gave them a hand. Luke himself pitched in with the sailors to help pull that boat up so that they could get under the ship. And the fear now, as you see in verse 17, is that they would run aground on Syrtis, on the Syrtis. Syrtis would be shifting sands that would be moving and shifting as a result of water, as a result of wind. Would be a very dangerous situation to enter the Syrtis. So they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. So they are going to lower the sail and the mast and just allow the wind to drive them. Verse 18, since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. The way they did this when they lightened the ship was to start with the heaviest cargo first to get rid of it. Then they're going eventually, we'll see, to throw out even the grain and the tackling of the ship. But they'll start with the very heavy items of cargo and furniture and such like. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And again, trying to lighten the load. And then verse 20 says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So try to visualize this. Here is a hurricane that just does not abate. It continues. And it is so dark because of this storm that the sun cannot shine through, or the stars. Sailors navigate by the stars. And sun, when the sun is out, gives them some idea of where they are. They have no idea where they are. They're totally lost. They are at the mercy of the wind for many days. When he says no small tempest, he means a big tempest, a big storm. And they are so discouraged that all hope of being saved was abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on some island. Now, this is an encouraging word. Paul had warned them not to set out from Crete. They should have listened. And what Paul feared would happen has happened, but something else has occurred. Notice verse 22. I urge you to take heart, be encouraged, right in the middle of this storm where we can't see where we are, where we're going, and it just continues, this hurricane continues with wind and rain. I encourage you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, only of the ship. Why? This very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. He is saying this to a group of pagans. There were sailors, Roman sailors. Of course, there was the centurion. There were prisoners who were being taken on this ship, probably for execution when they got to Rome. All together with the crew, the sailors, the prisoners, Paul, Luke, Aristarchus, altogether 276 souls. The great majority of them thus, though there may have been some Jews, the great majority of them would have been pagans. So this is a chance for Paul to testify to them. And so he tells them quite openly and quite unashamedly, this is an angel of the God to whom I belong. Of course, they believed in pagan gods. The God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And that word worship, latreo, is the word meaning worship that is due from every person to God. And he said, don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. This was the promise that God had made to Paul. I'll be with you, and you're going to appear before Caesar. And behold, he says to the crew and to the prisoners, all the people on the boat, behold, God has granted you all, those who sail with you. In other words, God has graciously granted, because of the fact that Paul is there and God intends for Paul to go to Rome, God has granted to you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God. it will be exactly as I've been told. However, we're going to run aground on some island. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. And why did they do that? Why did they suspect they were nearing land? Probably they heard the sound of the breakers on the shore, and they knew that that shore was nearby. So verse 28 says, they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. The fathom is the distance, apparently, if you put your middle fingers together and raise your arms, that distance is a fathom, which would suggest to me maybe about a yard or perhaps a meter. And so the sounding says 20 fathoms. We can imagine maybe 60 feet. And a little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. Well, that would be about 45 feet. So they know, obviously, they're getting close to shore. And fearing we might run onto the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Now, of course, there'd be a concern about rocks, of course, as the water is increasingly shallow. There's a likelihood of rocks, and if the ship strikes a rock, it could indeed cause the ship to sink. So the strategy is to let down 4 anchors from the stern. That would presumably, and it did, stop the ship where it was, but leaving the prow to be directed by the wind. And with the direction of the wind, they assumed that they were headed in the direction of land as they determined the land to be. So they let down the 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come so they could see where they were. But verse 30 says, the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out anchors from the bow. It is the sailors now who are absolutely terrified. And so they have a plan, and no doubt the pilot and the owner were in on this plan. They don't seem to stop them. And so they let down the boat, which had been hauled up, let it down to the water, and we're going to escape, and saying we're actually going to go lay out anchors from the bow, which would further secure the ship. And Paul realized what they were doing, and verse 31 says, he said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Well, the soldiers, under the direction, of course, of the centurion, at this point believed Paul, and so they cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go, thus stopping that plan from proceeding. This is one theological point I want us to look at just briefly before we go on, because God had said all souls will be saved. Nobody's going to be lost. Sounds very much like the promise that Christians have that if we're justified by faith in Christ, we are assured of our salvation. We're not going to be lost. And yet Paul says, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. This would suggest that there are responsibilities. And people wonder, how is that possible? The question, if they didn't stay in the ship, would they be lost? Yes. Are they going to be lost? No. Because God, who ordains the ends, also ordains the means. And working providentially through Paul, and obviously now through the centurion, through the soldiers, the plot is foiled. And that's the way God works. When he promises something, it will happen. Do we have responsibilities? Yes. Will God's promise come to pass? Yes. And then verse 33, as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you've continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Now, Linsky says, I don't think that they didn't eat anything at all. I think that they grabbed a bite here and there. That is possible. If you look at it literally, it's going to say they didn't have anything to eat. But Paul says, I want you to eat now. Gone 14 days. Verse 34, therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And so he reiterates the promise, God's promise, not a hair will perish from the head of any of you. So eat, relax. Verse 35, when he said these things, he took bread and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. I don't think this is an observation of the Lord's Supper. Might have been. But I think that's simply a matter that they're going to have something to eat. And Paul says, let's all just have something to strengthen us, have some food. But notice he took bread and he gave thanks to God in the presence of all. And Luke writes that quite deliberately. In the presence of all these pagans, these sailors, these prisoners, the crew, unashamedly, he thanked God for his food. And I'm sure that made an impression on them. He didn't do it for that purpose. He did it to thank God, but it was done in the presence of all. And verse 36 says, they were encouraged and ate some food themselves. So they believed Paul. Luke adds in verse 37, we were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. This is the last thing they can throw overboard. They started with the heavy cargo. They no doubt threw the furniture overboard. They threw the tackling overboard. And now they go down into the hold and pull up that precious cargo. That is the reason for this voyage, as far as the government is concerned. The passengers being incidental, this wheat is most valuable. They throw it out into the sea. The idea, of course, is that the lighter the ship, then the farther up it would be driven on the shore and perhaps save the ship. So here we are. You can see the journey, this long journey, that is 500 miles, if you look up to the top, 500 miles from Cauda to Malta across the open seas. And you can see they've indicated, the artist here has indicated the ships going in different directions as it's caught in this hurricane. And finally to Malta, where they are at this point. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. And that's why the wheat has been thrown over, that maybe they'll be driven all the way up on to the shore and the ship will be saved. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. Now, in the ancient times, rudders were not movable. So by a reference to rudders, Luke is talking about actually rudders that were like oars that were attached to the ship and could be loosened and used like oars by the ship, by the sailors, to guide them. And so with that and the sail, they can, and the wind being favorable, they're being blown in the direction of the beach. 41, but striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. These sandbars, that would be a reef, were under the level of the water and were not visible. So that couldn't be, they couldn't anticipate it being there. And that has simply caused the vessel to be stuck, as Luke says, and on the bow, but the stern is not on this sandbar, and so it's being tossed by the surf and being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan, verse 42, was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. Realizing the predicament they're in, they're just going to kill the prisoners. But 43, the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was, Luke adds, and so it was that all were brought safely to land. Here is a picture of the harbor at Malta, the Grand Harbor, which is called La Valletta, the Grand Harbor of Malta, and a smaller harbor, as you see, to the north. And I think you can visualize with these outcroppings of land here how a sandbar would be entirely possible in this situation. Now, exactly where they ran into this sandbar and ran aground, we do not know, but they're somewhere in this vicinity. Now we enter into the 28th chapter, when after we were brought safely through, in fulfillment to God's promise, after we were brought safely through, then we learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and was cold. And I'm sure you've noticed by now that everywhere kindness is extended, whether by the centurion or by, in this case, the people whom they encounter. These people, in a cold situation, it's raining, it's cold, decided to kindle a fire for them. The native people, the Maltese people, were Phoenicians. That means they spoke the language of Punic. And Paul understood that language. It is similar to Aramaic and Hebrew. So he's able to communicate with these people. They showed unusual kindness, welcomed us. Verse 3, when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks, and Paul goes out and gives a hand to these people and helps gather up kindling to burn. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. Evidently, this poisonous snake was in these sticks. And when the sticks were thrown on the fire, the viper, of course, from the heat, came out and bit Paul on the hand and simply clung to it. And verse 4 says, when the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man's a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. You see how they use the word justice? From this pagan mentality, certain things, natural things, were often personified as a god. So justice is seen almost here as a god who decides to punish the wicked, finds the wicked, and brings them to punishment. We hear of people using the word karma or the universe, something like that, from the standpoint of something is there to regulate, to determine right and wrong, to hold people accountable. So they use the word justice here. It's not allowed him to live. He's a murderer. Verse 5, he, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. Now, they were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. You can just get the picture. These people seeing this poisonous snake hanging to his hand and knowing what that venom would cause, namely death, it's lethal. And then Paul just casually shaking it off. And they looked at Paul, everybody's quiet. They expected him to swell up. They expected him to fall over dead. Nothing happened. So they decided, no, it isn't a matter that justice has condemned him as a murderer. They said he's a god. And verse 7, now in the neighborhood of that place, there were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Publius, no doubt, was a Roman, and very likely he owned large amounts of land on Malta. So he's called the chief man of the island. And once again, they are received and entertained hospitably for 3 days. This continues, this kind treatment of Paul and his group. And I assume that it's all 276. And therefore he must have had a very big house, and he showed great hospitality. Verse 8 says, "It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery. And Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him." This healing, and we've seen this before, is not a matter that Paul did it himself. It's done by the power of the Holy Spirit. And therefore, Paul would have prayed to God to seek the counsel of God as to whether God wished for him to proceed with this miracle. Apostles did not perform miracles at will. They did so only as directed by God through the Holy Spirit. And the answer is yes. He put his hands on him, which is characteristic, and healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. And notice verse 10, they also honored us greatly. And when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. Now, we don't know what happened during the time they were there. They were there 3 months altogether, waiting for a ship. And no doubt Paul preached. No doubt a congregation was established. Luke doesn't tell us that. He focuses very directly and particularly on the voyage itself. But he does make this comment of being honored. There was something about Paul, the way he conducted himself, and the way he acted, what he said. There was something about Paul that commanded respect of these people. And I'm really quite sure that this is the beginning of the church in Malta. There's a tradition that Publius was the first bishop of Malta. Now, the 3 months are going to expire. Verse 11, after 3 months, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria with the twin gods as a figurehead. I've tried to figure out exactly when they would have left. If they left in August from Caesarea, just when this would be. We know that the sailing season did not normally begin until March the 10th. And it is possible, I've tried to figure it up. I don't know that that full length of time had expired, but at least the owners of the ship and the pilot of this ship, this Alexandrian ship, felt that it was safe to go, and it was. Alexandria is a great shipbuilding place, and this is the Alexandrian ship. Again, we're seeing a situation where the government has no doubt leased this ship, and it's a cargo ship carrying passengers also. Luke mentions the twin gods as the figurehead. That would be Castor and Pollux, the twins. They were the gods of the sailors, and it was characteristic that on the prow of a ship, you would find carvings of Castor and Pollux. So verse 12, putting in at Syracuse, they sailed from Malta to Syracuse, which is in Sicily. We stayed there for 3 days. And from there, we made a circuit and arrived at Rhegium. And after 1 day, a south wind sprang up. And on the 2nd day, we came to Puteoli. There we found brothers and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. So once again, Christians are already there. Had these Christians come about as a result of preaching efforts from Rome? Rome was a large and active church with a great missionary program. It is quite possible that that is the case. But by this time, Christianity had obviously spread quite widely throughout Rome and the Roman area and throughout Italy. So we found brothers, and they invited them to stay 7 days. I assume they were all invited. 7 days. Again, you see Publius having no problems with Paul and stay there with his brothers in Christ. He doesn't have any fear that he's going to try to make an escape. And so Luke adds, we came to Rome. Luke, Aristarchus, and the entire group. Verse 15, and the brothers there, that is the Christians in Rome, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. We have seen how Christians have developed a custom of escorting people Remember, the Christians at Berea escorted Paul all the way to Athens. Now, Paul has never been to Rome. He doesn't know these people personally. And so they know about him, and they're going to come and greet him and escort him into Rome. He did have an acquaintance, obviously, from his letter to the Romans, which was written from Corinth much earlier. He did know some people there, so it's possible that some of these people did know him. But as far as being in Rome and meeting the vast number of Christians in Rome, that hadn't happened. So they go down the Appian Way to meet him. The Appian Way is the first highway ever built by the Romans. It was built in 312 BC by the censor Appius Claudius. Of course, other roads were added, many other highways were added over the years. And Paul sees them and he thanked God, I think he would, and took courage. And when we came to Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself. And again, you see how they trusted him with the soldier who guarded him. So let's look at the map again. You can see where Malta is, the bottom of the map. And from Malta, they're going to sail to Syracuse, beautiful city in Sicily, Greek city. And then they sailed up to Rhegium, known today as Rhegium, Calabria. And then when the nice, pleasant south wind came, they were going to sail through the Straits of Messina and then make the crossing up to Puteoli, and then up the Appian Way to Rome. The distance from Malta to Syracuse is 85 miles. From Syracuse to Rhegium is 85 miles. From Rhegium to Puteoli, 200 miles. From Puteoli to the Forum of Appius, 100 miles. And from the Forum of Appius to the Three Taverns, 10 miles. From Three Taverns to Rome, 35 miles. And the total distance that Paul traveled from Caesarea to Rome, 2,130 miles. Now, this is an interesting map because it shows the topography. You see the mountains that go down along the spine, like a spine along in Italy. And so they're going to go close to the coast. You see where the Appian Way is. From Puteoli, they're going to join the Appian Way. You see where Naples is. And you might also, at the very bottom to the right, where Herculaneum and Pompeii are, and then you see Mount Vesuvius. It's interesting that Paul would have, in this journey, come very close to 3 active volcanoes. That is, to Mount Etna in Sicily, to Stromboli, and to Vesuvius. Vesuvius at this point was not perceived to be an active volcano because it hadn't erupted for a long time, but it is only a few years until the year 79 when it will erupt and will destroy the cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii. And you remember that Drusilla, the wife of Felix, and their son were killed at Pompeii. So he goes up the Appian Way, first arrives at the Forum of Appius, and meets some Christians there who'd come all the way to that location, and then up to Three Taverns where some other Christians had stopped and were waiting for him, and then all the way into Rome. And this is the Appian Way. It is fortunate that much of the highway is still there. These are the original paving stones. And you can see about midway on this picture that they are modern stones. But the original stones are still evident many places along the way. There's a lady from Britain who some years ago wrote a book on the Appian Way. She traveled it herself and documented every part of it. There are some places where the road's broken up, but again, much of it is still intact. And all of those ruts were cut by hundreds of years of chariots going over them. So this is the Appia Forum, 45 miles from Rome. And this is Three Taverns. And it looks like at this point, there's a break in the road, but this is 35 miles from Rome. Here's a map of Rome. You can see the dark red line, and then you see another line of walls. The dark red will designate the old Severan walls. And these were the walls that were in place when Paul came. The lighter ones would be the Aurelian wall, which were built much later in 275 AD. The reason I'm using this map, if you will notice to the right, to the top and right, the Castra Praetoria. So Paul would have been delivered into the hands of the Praetorian prefect and put under his charge. That would have been the responsibility of the centurion to deliver him, as well as the prisoners, to the Praetorian prefect. Those prisoners would have been executed, no doubt. Paul was treated with kindness. The Praetorian prefect at this time was a man named Burrus. He was a chief advisor to Nero, and as long as he lived, he was able to counsel Nero to behave responsibly. Burrus was probably one of the most honest and efficient Roman administrators. He's captain of the Praetorian Guard. So Paul could not have been delivered into better hands than he was to Burrus, and he was treated favorably in keeping with the way he'd been treated all along. The Praetorian Guard was made up of 9 cohorts of 1,000 men each. They were the emperor's personal guard. They were the main military unit for the Roman army. Very distinguished. To be a Praetorian Guard would be quite a privilege. One other map I want us to see, and this is a map of the wall as it existed in Paul's time, so it's really easier to see. Toward the bottom, you see the Via Appia. It joins with the Via Latina, and then the Via Appia proceeds to enter Rome at the Porta Capena. He would have then traveled from that south part of Rome, south and east, to the northeast part of Rome at the Porta Viminalis, and that's where the Praetorian Guard, the camp was. Today, that's located very close to the main railway station in Rome, Termini, and part of this original wall is to be found there near what was the Praetorian camp, the Castra. The Castra itself, there's nothing much there left today, no evidence, and very little of the original wall. So that is a journey of Paul from all the way from Caesarea, all those thousands of miles, until he arrives in Rome, safely and treated well, according to God's promise. We have only one more episode to study in the book of Acts. That's the last of the 28th chapter. We'll finish that study, Lord willing, next week. Thank you for joining us for the class today. I wish God's richest blessings upon you throughout this week and indeed forever.